From cold orbit, I look down at Europe. Broken lines of light, hard borders, the scars of history. Zoom in. Russia, Ukraine, a fault line of memory and power. Why did Kiev's pivot trigger a security dilemma, and ultimately, the sound of gunfire? This war isn't just about lines on a map. It's a fight over identity, pride, and the stories of betrayal each side tells itself. From Moscow's point of view, Kiev's rejection of their shared Soviet past, renaming streets, taking down statues, separating itself from Soviet memory, plus its pivot towards the EU and NATO, was seen as a betrayal of history and a denial of its roots. When shared memories are cut off, every defensive step Kiev takes is interpreted as an attack. The security logic thus became locked. To maintain strategic depth and core interests, Russia felt forced to send a strong signal before the balance tipped completely towards the West. To understand the root cause, we have to go back to 1991. The Soviet Union fell apart, leaving a power vacuum and a deep economic crisis. From the ashes, a new state was born, independent Ukraine. But independence came with its own price. The economy was shaky, old symbols were torn down, and an entire society had to stumble through the wreckage to find a new path, a new identity. In the early years, Kiev pursued a multi-vector policy, trying to keep a delicate balance. They depended on cheap energy from Moscow, with vital gas pipelines running through their territory to Europe. They accessed both Eastern and Western markets, trying to use their position as a bridge. Security ties from the Soviet era were still there, with Russia's Black Sea Fleet docked in Crimea under a lease agreement. It was a tightrope walk between two worlds. But inertia couldn't beat the trend. In 2004, the Orange Revolution broke out, signaling a deep shift in Ukraine's political mindset. A new generation, grown up outside the shadow of the Soviet Union, began to look west. Kiev's pivot became clearer, towards European integration, towards liberal democratic values, and towards a future separate from Moscow's orbit. Talks for an association agreement with the EU began, promising a deeper economic and political relationship. On the streets of Kiev, blue and yellow mixed with EU flags. In the distance, riot shields clashed. Symbols changed, and so did positions. Moscow noted every signal. Along with the geopolitical pivot came a process many call desovietization or decolonization. This process was shown through strong symbolic actions. Statues of Lenin and other Soviet leaders were taken down across the country. Street names, squares and cities were changed, erasing the Soviet legacy and replacing it with names of Ukrainian national heroes. In the eyes of supporters, this was a necessary step to affirm a distinct national identity, to escape the shadow of an imposed past. However, from Moscow's perspective and for some Ukrainians, these actions were interpreted completely differently. They didn't see it as affirming identity, but as an attempt to erase shared history. They viewed it as a denial of centuries of cultural, linguistic, and blood ties. Every statue pulled down, every street renamed, deepened the rift in the relationship, seen as an act of betraying shared memory. From the square to the classroom, Lenin statues pulled down, street signs changed, history books rewritten. For supporters, liberation of memory. For opponents, erasure of shared memory. 2014 made the ground crack. The Maidan protests reached their peak, overthrowing pro-Moscow President Viktor Yanukovych after he refused to sign the association agreement with the EU. For the West and many Ukrainians, it was a revolution of dignity. For Russia, it was a Western-backed coup. Moscow's reaction was swift and decisive. Crimea, with its strategic naval base and a large Russian-speaking population, was annexed after a controversial referendum. Soon after, the war in Donbass erupted, as Russian-backed separatist forces declared independence in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Economic sanctions hit Russia from the west. Diplomatic channels froze. Trust, already fragile, now completely collapsed. The crack from 2004 had become an unbridgeable chasm by 2014. In the years after 2014, Ukraine's identity-building process sped up even more. New laws were passed, boosting the status of the Ukrainian language in public life, media and education, which Russian speakers saw as pushing aside their language. History curricula in schools were rewritten, focusing on periods when Ukraine was dominated by Russia and the Soviet Union, and honoring national independence movements. The battle over historical interpretation became fierce. One side saw this as a natural and rightful process for a formerly colonized nation finding its own voice. The other side saw it as proof that an anti-Russian state was being built right next to their border, a state deliberately brainwashing the younger generation to hate their shared heritage. And then there was the NATO issue. In the Kremlin's eyes, Ukraine wasn't just a neighbor. It was a crucial security buffer, a strategic depth protecting Russia's core from the reach of a military alliance they considered hostile. Every step NATO took eastward since the late 90s was noted by Moscow with increasing alarm. The promise at the 2008 Bucharest summit that Ukraine will become a NATO member was seen as an absolute red line. When that strategic buffer not only leaned west culturally and politically, but also openly sought military protection from Russia's adversary, Moscow's security logic said, action must be taken. An unmistakable forceful signal had to be sent. The red line had to be redrawn by force, before that strategic depth completely disappeared. This is the classic security dilemma. Steps that Ukraine and its Western partners saw as defensive, strengthening self-defense capabilities, seeking alliances, were seen by Russia as an existential threat, leading to an uncontrollable spiral of escalation. Minsk I, then Minsk II, ceasefires on paper. Shells still fell sporadically, supply lines, local skirmishes, trenches grew deeper. Meeting rooms lit up, chairs slowly emptied of trust. Both sides rearmed, drilled, moved troops. Tactical maps showed arrows. Red line bands grew thicker each winter. In a security dilemma, one side's defensive move becomes a threat in the other's eyes, and an excuse to act, a self-reinforcing spiral. Of course, there's a completely different perspective. That perspective emphasizes that Ukraine is a sovereign nation, with an absolute right to choose its own path of development, to choose its own alliances. By this logic, no nation has the right to veto another nation's future, or to impose a sphere of influence on its neighbors. It's a clash between two fundamental principles of international order, the harsh realism of power and spheres of influence, clashing with the ideal of national self-determination. And in the middle of this clash of abstract logics is a bloody battlefield. The price is revealed every day, in every film, in every story. Cities shattered, turned into flat ground. Millions forced to leave their homes, becoming refugees. Families torn apart, not knowing when they will reunite. And young soldiers on both sides of the front lines, who may have shared a history, now look up at the same winter sky from opposite trenches, waiting for the next order. Crowded train stations, passports trembling in hands, night trains, dark windows, the power grid flickering against the winter sky. Every shell that falls not only destroys lives, but also tears another page from a shared past and writes another dark page into the history of two nations. This price isn't only paid by Ukraine. Russia is also paying with diplomatic isolation, the economic burden of sanctions, the huge cost of the war, and the erosion of its legitimacy on the international stage. Europe and the world are also paying, with an energy crisis, rising inflation, and the entire security structure built after the Cold War shaken to its core. Gas prices jumping, electricity meters spinning fast, inflation headlines filling front pages. European nights softly lit, energy saving becoming a habit, victory, defeat. Those words seem too simple. History will judge long after the last gun falls silent. But the immediate cost is clear: a crisis of legitimacy, social breakdown, economic shock, militarization of life, population decline, and a war of memory that will last for generations. When memory is forced and identity is denied, when one people feels its history erased and the other feels betrayed, the final bill is always paid with lives, with futures, and with wounds in the soul that are hard to heal. I don't pretend there's an easy way out. Only this is certain. Nations pursue security with the hard logic of power, but it's ordinary people who pay the price. And somewhere between national pride and fears about security, between conflicting interpretations of history, a generation is inheriting a legacy of ruin, and both the right and the burden to remember the past differently. State security is an equation. Human lives are the easily erased unknown. May future memory be brave enough to tell it differently. In the end, nations that disregard history, deny their roots, and chase the allure of power rarely come to a good end. Erasing memories only deepens the wound. A severed identity will come back to demand its debt. Hasty decisions, extremist slogans, or red lines drawn in emotion all turn into real suffering. For real people, living real lives. To go far, honor the past, talk across differences, and keep a cool head against the temptations of power. Thank you for watching until the end. If you found this helpful, please subscribe to the channel. We tell history fairly, deeply, and inspiringly.